Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem here of scarcity. You can't always get what you want. It's the inability of limited resources to satisfy people's wants and needs. And we already know that the goal of economics and everything that we're doing is happiness. We want individuals and society overall to have much greater wealth, satisfaction. We want people to be better off. We understand that when people deal with scarcity, they have to make choices. And those choices, of course, are trade offs between one thing or another. Now, of course, economics is the science of trade offs and dealing with the concept of cost. And it's the second thing that we're really going to look at here, this idea of a cost and the idea of how costs are actually related to trade offs. So, if we ask a question like, what's the cost of climate change? We'll often get a common answer like, I paid nothing for it, therefore it costs me nothing. And that's just, in economics, we would look at this and say, what? Of course, there are costs. Okay. We know people have choices, but rule number three, what you're going to get now is that those choices all have a cost. Every choice you make has a cost. Well, what does that mean, that word cost? So, what are we actually getting at here? Well, first of all, we understand that in economics, there is no such thing as free. There is no free. Nothing is free at all. As the famous Milton Friedman used to say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every choice you make has a cost associated to it. And the problem is that most people fail to remember that costs come in different areas, and they are sometimes they're kind of subjective. When people think about cost, they usually think about this kind of cost first. They think about a price that you paid, and that is known as an explicit cost, what you actually pay in money. Okay. But there are also things like opportunity costs, which is what you gave up when you made a choice. There's also marginal cost. How much more would you give up in a choice? Or sunk costs. These are costs that were already borne that you can't get back. And then, of course, we have external costs, also known as externalities. These are costs that impact unrelated people to the decision that is being made. We're going to look at each of these, but this one up here, this first one, that is an explicit cost. It is a direct cost with money. Everything else here is known as an implicit cost. Okay? These are things that have nothing really to do with money, but instead they're dealing with the trade-off of choices. So if we get common answers like 165 billion in weather disaster costs to climate change, 14 trillion in lost GDP, $2,000 a year in extra insurance, 40 million a year into green energy, these things would be examples of explicit costs. They are payments that are made, money that is spent. That is anything when you see these numbers, the price you paid for something, that is an explicit cost. What it does, it actually creates a clear understanding of a consequence by attaching something that we all know in common, and that is money. We don't know the value of everything really unless we have a standard that we set and say, okay, we all agree that this is money and that money has that kind of value. So when we have an explicit cost and we see that number, that price, we can all kind of attach an understanding about how valuable something is. The common measurement is money. So this is kind of a more precise measurement of what is given up in a choice, and that's, of course, money. When you walk into a store and you buy a gallon of milk, and a gallon of milk is $4.50, you kind of know what that feels like because you lost the $4.50, and we all have that in common about losing money. So when we get into things like climate change and we say, well, we're going to spend $40 million in climate change, we know what that $40 million means. We know that it's more than 30 million. We know that it's less than 50 million. And what it can do to some of these biggest impacts of climate change, all the way from children to fossil fuels, construction, beef, burning stuff, deforestation, gas flaring, trash, that 40 million going towards things, we can see what 40 million is going to do to fossil fuels or construction or deforestation. We can actually measure that because you have to buy stuff to deal with these things. The thing is that explicit costs aren't the ones that are the hardest ones to deal with. The hardest ones to deal with are when you ask about what is $40 million going to do to these things, but also What would the $40 million have done if you spent it on things like transportation? Or what did you give up spending it on fossil fuels that would have been better off in dealing with burning of wood or agriculture? Okay, you gave $40 million to deforestation. What was given up in terms of dealing with the production of metal and concrete? What was the trade-off from the $40 million? Okay, and in economics, we talked about how there's no solution to scarcity. And another term that is often used is that there are no solutions at all to scarcity. There are only trade-offs that are made. You can't solve something. You're simply going to trade off one thing for the other. And a trade-off is what you sacrificed when you made a decision, aka an implicit cost, something that's not borne by money or common measurement. Now you're just looking at, I did X, and for X, I sacrificed Y. Okay. So, and this is kind of, we talk about how you deal with the problem of scarcity. Well, you have unlimited wants, you have limited resources. And of course, since everybody has different values, everyone has different trade-offs they make or they find acceptable. So your explicit costs, like in the United States, explicit costs, we know what those means. We know what that measurement is. It's common. But when you get into implicit costs, then value structures, norms, and mores actually come into play. And this is where you get into the concept of knowing the difference between a good economist and a bad one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. A good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those effects that must be foreseen. And you will often see this picture that is presented when you're dealing with implicit costs. This is from World War II. A statistician went to the UK and they basically had all this steel and they wanted to figure out where to put armor on the plane. Well, this is the picture of where planes that were returning from Europe were being shot up. And eventually everybody's like, oh, okay, well, if the planes are being shot up there, where you have to put the steel is in these areas where they're being shot so they're better protected. And the statistician who also worked in economics said, you're not seeing the whole thing here. The whole thing here is that, hey, look, these planes actually came back and they came back being shot in these locations. Therefore, the place you don't want to you want to reinforce isn't where those bullet holes are. You're just looking at the thing right in front of you. The place you want to, replace are the pilot, where the engines are, and then the middle of these planes where you don't see the holes. Those are the dangerous points because you can't see the planes that got shot down because they're gone. But the planes that were shot in these locations keep returning. So that's where you're seeing the implicit cost of making a choice. And since steel is scarce and where you put it on the plane is scarce, you got to be careful with these issues of explicit and implicit costs. And the thing is that when you get into politics, politics insists that there are no costs. Politics is the promise that we're going to solve everything. But politicians will never say no. They're never going to say it's going to cost you this because that would be wildly, wildly unpopular. Okay? So you get this over and over again. Well, I promised to do this and I promised to do that and we can do this and do that and da 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 da. And the reality is, no, you're not. You're not going to solve all these things. You're going to, because you're going to tell people to make trade-offs, but you don't ever want to tell somebody, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to tell somebody no because I have to make a trade-off. Everything that happens is going to have some kind of trade-off occur. And Thomas Sowell, a famous Stanford economist, said the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. Scarcity exists no matter whatever anybody else tells you otherwise. Okay, so when you get into things like we need to preserve the environment at all costs, please remember, I want to save the environment too, but it is costly, and those trade-offs may not be worth it. And you might say, well, it doesn't cost anything to do simple little things to help the environment. No, it does. There is no free. When you make a choice, there is a cost to that choice. Okay. Then you might ask, well, why do people make bad economic decisions in the first place? Well, because we have incomplete information of every choice or every option that we have when we make a choice. People's values and experiences are different. I mean, somebody who's an alcoholic is going to probably make a different choice because they are under the influence of alcohol. That's bad. And they're going to make different choices. People that are poor versus rich are going to make different choices. People don't want to research all possible outcomes. You don't want to actually totally know how your food is made or where something is built or produced. You don't want to know everything that happens because you have scarcity with your time and you don't want to research every potential outcome of every choice you make. And sometimes people lie to you. There's fraud or unknown outcomes and variables. Somebody is lying. So all these things go into your decision-making process. But in the end, we want to understand that there are implicit and explicit costs. Explicit costs have to do with what you paid. Implicit costs have to do with these trade-offs that we're going to be looking at a deeper level: opportunity, marginal, sunk, and external costs. Okay, so know the difference between explicit costs and implicit costs, basic ideas of trade-offs. And in the future sections, we're going to get into these different implicit costs a lot more deeply.